Good morning, everyone. Today on Perspectives, we're having a conversation with Mobile County's new sheriff, Paul Burch. Paul Burch, of course, is a familiar face to many of us who've interacted with the Mobile County Sheriff's Office for the last 20-plus years. But before he became one of the deputies who you may remember seeing brief the TV news crews on the Sheriff's Department's latest incident, a standoff, the end of a high-speed chase, a drug bust and arrest of trafficking suspects, a shooting or homicide. Then Deputy Burch served in uniform patrol previously, along with general investigation, homicide investigation, as well as narcotics vice investigation. Sheriff Burch's decision to serve may have started about 40 years ago in 1983. When he joined the U.S. Navy, he became a Navy Seabee, embracing their motto, "We build, we fight," and of course their can-do attitude. Now, after the Navy, his law enforcement career started in Alabama's capital city with the Montgomery Police Department in 1989. But the native Mobilian returned home in 1990 to join the Mobile Police Department. Then, after 9 years of service with MPD, Burch put on the brown uniforms of the Sheriff's Department under Jack Tillman's administration. Our guest today on Perspectives, Mobile County Sheriff Paul Burch. Well, we'll hear from the sheriff, who is the new sheriff, succeeding Sam Cochran, right after this quick break when Perspectives continues. Today on Perspectives, our very special know Paul Burch from over the years and the familiar face with the Sheriff's Department. But you know, this all started as far as your first law enforcement job in the late 80s. Your first job was in Montgomery, but let's talk about Paul Burch coming out of high school, because you had some ideas, and you weren't just from any family either. You were from a family that had a long history with law enforcement here. Tell us a little bit about that, and then of course what your thoughts were coming out of high school.
Well, I knew at an early age, you know, that I wanted to be a police officer in law enforcement, and as I talked with my grandparents and then my dad, you know, I learned that there had been a Burch on the city police department since the city has existed, in a variety of leadership roles. There have been some that were chiefs, some that were interim chiefs. Back then, I think they had chief of detectives. You know, one of my great uncles was, and I actually, my grandfather, before he passed away, gave me his gun that he carried on duty, which is the old pencil barrel 38.
Right.
And so I have that, you know, in a display case. And so there is a long family history of law enforcement. You know, my youngest son is a police officer with the city, and so, you know, the tradition will continue.
So, thinking where you were as high school, I think you said you were about 17 when you came out. Why didn't you enlist with the police department at that time instead of the U.S. Navy?
Well, at the time, Mobile's policy was you had to be 23 to be a police officer. So I signed up for the Navy Seabees at 17 for 5 years. So I would hit that 23 mark and be ready to go when I got out. You know, and to add to that, you know, just desire to serve in law enforcement, even though I was in the Seabees as a welder or steel worker, they had started what they called a Master at Arms rating, which was an investigative arm of the Navy Seabees, or the Navy, and so that's what I did my last 2 years in the Navy. So it was a very easy transition.
Right. So you had a chance to get some of that knowledge and experience prior to finally coming out of the service and to police. So I guess that was 89 when you separated from the Navy after the 5 years.
I did, and to my disappointment, Mobile was not hiring at the time.
Okay.
So I had a friend of mine who was in the same unit as I was in the Navy, and he was from, I think, Opelika, and we were getting out around the same time. So he's like, "Hey, Montgomery PD is hiring." So we applied, and ironically, I got a position he didn't. And but that was a really good experience. You know, Montgomery's Academy was at the time what we were told was the second toughest in the state. You know, only second to the Trooper Academy, and it was tough. I would go through boot camp before I do that.
Right.
So we started with 37 candidates and graduated 11.
11, so definitely some serious business there. What made it tougher than, say, some of the other law enforcement academies around the state?
They were, I mean, the physical part of it, but more so the academic. I mean, if you were a half of a point off on a test or an assignment, you're gone. You know, there were no second chances, so it really made you. It made you commit. If you wanted to succeed and be a police officer, you know, and proudly I graduated second in my class. But it was a lot of work, and there were good times. Montgomery was a really good place to learn the basics of policing, and have some great memories there.
What did you use that you had learned in the Navy, you think, in that situation, having that tough road there ahead to get
going that extra step and just being a little more inquisitive, and rather than just go answer a call, you know, write a report, you know, I always wanted to know the why and, you know, take it a step further. And so I learned to gather a little more information, and then if it was a type call where a detective's coming out, you know, you kind of got them a good start, you know, to building their case. And I just have always wanted to know why, you know, especially when someone decides to commit a certain act, or you know, what they were thinking when they made that decision. And I think that has been a good building block for my career.
All right, so after a little less than 2 years there, you headed back south down to the Gulf Coast, and I guess the jobs were open again.
They were, and you know, it's kind of funny thing, the difference in the police department in Montgomery and police department here, you know, I didn't know the differences. We had what you see on TV, like, you know, a desk sergeant that's there 24 hours a day, and so I got injured the night before my interview. Broke my collarbone, dislocated my shoulder in a fight. And so, you know, I'm in a sling. I'm trying to call for a desk sergeant. There was no such thing in Mobile. Okay. So I'm in fear that I'm going to miss this opportunity to get hired. Right. So I was there. I couldn't drive, so I got a ride down, got to Mobile, took the sling off, which was extremely painful. Okay. And put on a suit and went to my interview.
Wow. So who was chief at that time?
Harold
Johnson?
I'm trying. Yes, Harold Johnson was chief at the time.
I know in that transition.
It was right close to that.
Greenberg did some.
Yes, I think Harold Johnson was just taking over at the time.
Okay. So when you came to Mobile, did you have any family on the force at that moment who could give you a little insight?
I had a second cousin who was on the department, and you know, he obviously took me around and introduced me to people, and at the time a couple of my uncles or great uncles who were still living but retired, you know, I you know, talked with them, and obviously they, you know, told me who I needed to get to know, and those kind of things. And
that's always
so it certainly helped.
Yeah. Now, knowing Chief Johnson, I knew him pretty good. He was a Navy man too. Did that help you at all?
You know, I only had 2 encounters with him, pretty much, you know, the time I was there, and you know, one was, you know, when he swore me in, and then I was involved in an incident after being on about 2 years, and so I got to see a different side of him. I was also going to school at the time, and you know, I was involved in a shooting, and so you get this mandatory time off you have to take. So I was worried about missing tests at school, but you know, I got a knock on the door a couple of days later, and Chief Johnson had gone to my school, got my homework assignments, and brought it to me personally. So, you know, I know he had a gruff side of him, but I got to see a different side.
That's right. That's right.
And, you know, you can have nothing but respect for somebody after something like that.
That's very true. And I remember he loved his time in the Navy as well. So, a Burch on MPD, which is a family tradition, but for some reason you decided to leave and head to the Sheriff's Department 9 years after being on the force. What took place to make you make that transition? Well, you know, it's really easy. You know, it was money. Okay. And you know, I had a young family at the time, and you know, there was, at that time, you couldn't get on the sheriff's office, you know, unless you were asked, and there was, you know, openings didn't come up until someone retired or passed away. And so at the time, for the most part,
there'd be 50, 60 people competing for one spot.
My goodness.
Sheriff Tillman reached out, and you know, he knew I'd had some success as an investigator, especially in the narcotics, you know, part of the job. And he reached out and to see if I would be interested in coming over. And you know, it was not an easy decision, you know, because I was comfortable in Mobile. I had a great career going in Mobile, but you know, he made the money worth it at the time, and because you know, back then, any small percentage it was a significant raise when you've got, you know, 3 small children.
Yes, that's so true. So that would have been 1999, roughly.
It was March of 1999, and you know, one of the things that also made me reluctant. My daughter was at Murphy at the time, and they had a trip planned to Ireland for the band. So like 2 weeks after I was supposed to be starting. So, you know, I was reluctant to bring it up during the interview, but, you know, you know, after being offered the job, met with Sheriff Tillman, said, hey, look, I have to tell you this. And he's like, absolutely, go have fun. And so that was a big relief too, because I was worried I was going to lose out on that opportunity.
And I guess him having worked in the schools for years, he understood what you were feeling and thinking, especially about your daughter and the band.
He did.
Yeah.
And you know, we had a great time, and I was just, you know, glad I had that opportunity.
That's right. Ready to go to work when you got back.
Yeah.
We're going to take a break on that, and when we come back, we're going to talk more and talk about some of the law enforcement issues that you have to deal with now as sheriff of the county. Our very special guest, Paul Burch. We're talking about the new sheriff of Mobile County. That and more when we return this morning on Perspectives. Welcome back to Perspectives and our very special guest, Mobile County Sheriff Paul Burch. And we're talking about the career leading up to heading to the Sheriff's Department in 1999. Now, how far back were you thinking that this is something that you would like to do one day in law enforcement, be at the highest position, either city as the chief or the county as a sheriff? How far back were you thinking about that?
You know, I would really just say the last 3 or 4 years. You know, I really enjoyed being in the field, and especially as a mid-level supervisor, and where you could make things happen and still have a lot of freedom. And then I was fortunate to, you know, rise through the ranks pretty quickly, and you know, where you're still able to make a difference. But I really only thought about being, you know, the sheriff or chief of police in the last probably 3 or 4 years.
Now, how difficult is that to take it from that thought process to getting in the midst of what it takes to become that? Because it becomes a political thing more so than just a law enforcement thing.
It is, and that are some of the struggles. I've always hated politics, and I'm just a fact kind of person, and you know, this is the way it should be, and that's, but you know, as I made that decision or got more serious about, you know, that thought process, I began to learn, you know, the political side of it, and you know, Sheriff Cochran is probably one of the best politicians anywhere around this county or surrounding counties, and so I had a great teacher and began. And I didn't necessarily immediately share my thoughts with him, but I began paying attention to what he was doing and the different, I guess, organizations that he spent time with or you know, paid attention to, and that's, you know, once I made up my mind, it was an easy, you know, track to follow.
Right. And when you look at that, how difficult is it to have your thought process there, and then at the same time making sure that your law enforcement experience and what you bring to the table as far as that part, because I know they've had sheriffs in the past that weren't even on the force at that time and became elected.
Yep. Well, and I'll back up a little bit. Another reason that I really made up my mind is I love people. I love talking with people, interacting with people, and you know, I learned a lot of interacting with the public and people from Sheriff Tillman and watching what, you know, how he interacted with the public. I mean, he never met a stranger.
Right.
And so, you know, I learned that from him. I learned a lot of the political side from the sheriff. And then as I began to form the way I wanted to move forward and do things, you know, the political part, you know, the work part of it's fun. Mm-hmm. The political part is troublesome to navigate sometimes. Right. And because, you know, what I've learned pretty early on, you know, you can make what you think is a good decision or you know, support something, but you're going to make 50% is going to be happy and 50% not so happy. Right. And you just have to look at what is, number one, best for the community. And that's the standard that I look at everything at. And then what's best for my coworkers.
When you look at law enforcement today in 2023, is it a more difficult job than it has been over your nearly 34 years in law enforcement? It
is, and it's disappointing in some aspects. You know, I've tried to follow, you know, some of the cases that go on in different, you know, court systems within the county. You know, juries are not near as law enforcement supportive as they used to be. And you know, some of that is just, you know, because of the changes, you know, that have gone on over the past few years. And then some, we call it the CSI effect, you know, that they see these things on TV, and when you're not able to do that for them in court, they don't understand why. And you know, you get DNA results overnight. Well,
right.
You know, really that takes
You've got to solve everything in an hour.
And so that truly does have an effect in a trial. And a lot of times, you know, the prosecutors can mitigate that theory during their, I guess, opening and closing remarks. Mm-hmm. But it presents its challenges. But I think just the overall sentiment toward law enforcement has changed, you know, especially with the younger generation. Mm-hmm. And that's just something we have to work to try to build back up that support, and you know, we try to do that on a daily basis.
Just yesterday we had an incident in Shelby County where 2 deputies were serving a warrant and ended up turning into, both of them were shot in that situation. Is it a more violent job for the law enforcement officer now?
It is. I mean, even, you know, and that hits home because it's just, you know, right up the interstate.
Right.
But, you know, it looks around the country, almost every week you read about, you know, law enforcement, whether it be deputies, federal, local, respond to some type of scene and they're ambushed, you know, when they pull up. I mean, just every week. And, you know, if you dial back 10 years, you just, you know, that might happen once or twice a year.
What do you tell your officers who are out there in the field on the streets? What do you tell them?
Well, we train for those scenarios. We have in-service training several times a year, and it's going on right now. And, you know, small groups go and train in tactics, and we provide them, you know, what I consider very adequate equipment to protect themselves. And we always preach, you know, just a heightened alert on certain kinds of calls. I mean, always be alert and observant, but, you know, there are certain kind of calls like domestics and where
always
historically
dangerous.
That seems to be where the ambushes come in. Right.
A lot of things going on. Let's talk briefly about permitless carry. And where did you stand with the sheriffs, or what was the thought when you were presented the information and that bill trying to get passed initially?
You know, I was opposed to it simply for the just not being able to vet those who just can carry a gun anywhere. You know, I'm a strong supporter of the Second Amendment, and, you know, will always be a staunch defender of the Constitution. However, you know, what it really has done is take away some tools from us, you know, just where if previously, if somebody had a concealed gun that you could see, you could ask them if they had a permit. Mm-hmm. And a lot of times you know they're up to no good just through experience. And that's taken away that tool, because what we have been able to do in the past is, okay, you know, they don't have a permit. We find out they've got a history. And you know, through arresting for the permit, sometimes they have drugs. Mm-hmm. And then we're many times over the last year and a half, 2 years, we've been able to tie that gun to other crimes. And that's one of the vital tools that it has taken away. Mm-hmm. And now we can still get there sometimes, but it's a much bigger hurdle to get over.
As we close out, let's talk about some of the things that are going on in law enforcement, where you were talking about the public and the community, where there are concerns about the officers who are not upholding what you're teaching and standing for the code of law enforcement. How do you handle that? How do you handle those people who may not be representing you the way that you want to be represented?
Well, you know, that could, you know, you could have to really determine what kind of scenario. If it's something serious, you know, we would certainly separate ourselves from them. And, you know, but I believe a lot of people deserve a second chance and with corrective action. But, you know, what I've told the deputies that I work with is that, you know, I work for the people, and you know, when you're out there, you're representing the sheriff and the sheriff's office. And you know, we don't really encounter those problems very often. We're fortunate that a lot of the deputies that we have are a little more mature because they come from other agencies. So, but I believe that, you know, anyone who tells you if you mistreat someone or disrespectful to someone, you know, we're going to act accordingly, and it's not going to be a pleasant conversation. And if it's something that, you know, really egregious, then you know, you're probably going to find yourself looking for a job.
Never enough time, but we've enjoyed this time with you today. And Sheriff Paul Burch, we wish you a lot of success in your new position. And of course, we'll be talking over the next months and years as well.
Thank you. I'd look forward to it.
All right. Our very special guest, Mobile County Sheriff Paul Burch. And if you want to contact the Sheriff's Office for more information, go to their website. You see it listed there, as well as that crime tips page to let them know about things you're seeing. Report that. I'm Eric Reynolds. Have a great week ahead. See you next Saturday.